1943, Camp Livingston, Louisiana. The station hospital is overwhelmed. Wounded soldiers are arriving from North Africa and Italy. Men with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, infected surgical sites. The white nurses are exhausted, working 18-hour shifts, unable to keep up. In another section of the same hospital, black nurses stand ready. They're trained. They're qualified. They're watching white soldiers die from complications that proper nursing care could prevent. Lieutenant Della Raney Jackson is one of those black nurses. She can see the white wards from where she works. She can hear the calls for nurses that go unanswered because there aren't enough white nurses. She has the skills to help. She's prohibited from doing so. Army regulations are clear. Black nurses treat black soldiers only. White soldiers are treated by white nurses. Even if white soldiers are dying, even if black nurses are available, segregation doesn't bend for emergencies. Then the situation becomes critical. Too many casualties, not enough nurses. Men are dying. The hospital commander makes a decision. He violates Army policy. He orders black nurses, including Lieutenant Della Raney Jackson, to begin treating white soldiers. This is the moment Della has been waiting for. The moment to prove that black nurses are just as capable as white nurses. The moment to save lives. But it's also the moment when she discovers that competence and courage mean nothing if your skin is the wrong color. This is the true story of Della Raney Jackson. Not a story of how she died, but how she lived, how she fought, how she proved herself for 30 years, and how America finally, reluctantly, acknowledged what she had always been, equal. Della Hayden Raney was born on April 10, 1918, in Cambridge, Ohio. Her parents were working class. Her father worked in the local industries. Her mother took in laundry and did domestic work. Cambridge was a small city in eastern Ohio, part of the industrial belt that ran through the state. It wasn't the Deep South, but it was segregated nonetheless. Not by explicit law like Mississippi or Alabama, but by custom, by practice, by the unspoken rules that everyone understood. Black families lived in certain neighborhoods. Black children attended certain schools. Black workers got certain jobs. The boundaries were clear. Della grew up smart and determined. She excelled in school. She was one of those students' teachers, remember, the kind who asked questions, who wanted to understand not just what, but why, who had ambitions beyond what her circumstances suggested was possible. She graduated from high school in Cambridge in the mid-1930s. College wasn't an option. Her family didn't have money for that. But she needed a profession, something more than domestic work or factory labor. She decided on nursing. Nursing in the 1930s was one of the few professional paths open to black women: teaching, nursing, and social work. Those were basically the options. Everything else was closed. Della applied to nursing schools. Most rejected her. Ohio nursing schools in the 1930s were overwhelmingly white. Some explicitly excluded black students. Others had informal quotas, accepting maybe 1 or 2 black students per class, if they accepted any at all. Della kept applying. She was accepted to Freedman's Hospital School of Nursing in Washington, D.C. Freedman's Hospital was legendary in the black community. Founded after the Civil War to serve freed slaves, it had become one of the premier institutions training black medical professionals. It was affiliated with Howard University, the most prestigious historically black university in the country. Della moved to Washington, D.C. in the late 1930s to begin her nursing training. The program was rigorous. 3 years of intensive study. Anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, patient care. The curriculum was identical to white nursing schools. The standards were just as high, maybe higher, because black nurses knew they would be judged more harshly than white nurses. Any failure would be attributed to their race. Any success would be dismissed as an exception. Della excelled. She graduated from Freedman's Hospital School of Nursing in 1940. She was 22 years old. She was a registered nurse. She was a professional. She found work at Freedman's Hospital, staying on as a staff nurse. She gained experience caring for patients, learning the realities of nursing that textbooks couldn't teach. How to handle emergencies. How to comfort frightened patients. How to work 36-hour shifts when the hospital was short-staffed. How to save lives. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, America entered World War II. The military began a massive expansion. Millions of men were drafted. Military hospitals needed to expand to treat the casualties that war would produce. The Army Nurse Corps began recruiting. They needed thousands of nurses. Della saw an opportunity. She could serve her country. She could use her skills. She could earn a commission as an officer, something almost unimaginable for a black woman in 1941. But there was a problem. The Army Nurse Corps didn't accept black nurses. The policy had been in place since the Corps was founded in 1901. The reasoning, like all military segregation, was circular and self-justifying. Black nurses would have to care for white soldiers. White soldiers wouldn't accept care from black nurses. Therefore, black nurses couldn't serve. The fact that this reasoning was based on racism, rather than any evidence about nursing competence, didn't matter. It was policy. Black nurses protested. Civil rights organizations protested. The NAACP launched a campaign. Black newspapers ran editorials. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American. All the major black newspapers demanded that the Army Nurse Corps accept black nurses. The hypocrisy was obvious. America claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy against fascist racism. But America's own military practiced racial discrimination. Black men were being drafted to fight, but black women who wanted to serve as nurses were rejected. Finally, in 1941, the Army relented, sort of. They announced they would accept black nurses, but with severe restrictions. The quota was 56 black nurses, total, for the entire war. And those 56 would serve in completely segregated conditions. They would treat black soldiers only. They would not be assigned to hospitals or units with white soldiers. They would have separate quarters, separate dining facilities, separate everything. It was tokenism designed to deflect criticism without actually integrating anything. But for black nurses desperate to serve, it was an opening. Della applied to the Army Nurse Corps in late 1941. Thousands of black nurses applied. The competition was intense, 56 positions for thousands of qualified applicants. Della was accepted. On March 7, 1942, Della Raney was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. Nurse Corps, she was one of the first group of black women ever commissioned as officers in the United States military. This was historic. Black women had served in support roles in previous wars, as cooks, as laundresses, as various support personnel. But commissioned officers, that was new. That was revolutionary. Della and the other black nurses in that first group understood what they represented. They were pioneers. They were breaking barriers. They would be judged not just as individuals, but as representatives of their entire race. Any mistake would be used as evidence that black women couldn't be officers. Any success would have to be extraordinary to be acknowledged at all. Della was assigned to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. Camp Livingston was a massive Army training facility built in 1941 in central Louisiana, near the town of Alexandria. At its peak, the camp held over 90,000 soldiers. It had everything needed to train civilians to be soldiers: rifle ranges, obstacle courses, training areas for tank and artillery units, and a large station hospital to treat training injuries and illnesses. It was also in Louisiana, deep South Louisiana. Jim Crow wasn't just custom here. It was law, enforced by the state, by local government, by police, by white civilians who considered segregation the natural order. Camp Livingston itself was completely segregated. Black soldiers and white soldiers trained on the same base, but in completely separate facilities. Separate barracks, separate training areas, separate mess halls, separate everything. The station hospital was segregated too. Black patients in one wing, white patients in another wing. Black nurses assigned to black patients. White nurses assigned to white patients. Never mixing. Never crossing that line. Della arrived at Camp Livingston in spring 1942. She was assigned to the ward for black soldiers. Her patients were men who got sick during training. Pneumonia, which was common in crowded barracks, infections, training injuries, broken bones from obstacle courses, sprains and strains. She provided care, administered medications, monitored vital signs, changed dressings, everything a nurse does. The ward for black soldiers was inferior to the ward for white soldiers. This was obvious and deliberate. The black ward had older equipment, fewer nurses per patient, less space, but Della did her job. She cared for her patients. She saved lives. She earned the respect of her patients and grudgingly, of her white supervisors who had initially been skeptical that black nurses could handle the responsibility. Off-duty, Della faced constant discrimination. She was a commissioned officer.
Off-duty, Della faced constant discrimination. She was a commissioned officer. Her rank should have entitled her to use the officers' club, the officers' mess, the officers' quarters. But she was black. Camp Livingston had separate facilities for black officers, smaller, less well-maintained, segregated. The town of Leesville, just outside the camp, was hostile. Black soldiers and black officers who went into town faced harassment. Some local businesses refused to serve black military personnel regardless of rank. Some white civilians openly expressed resentment that black people were wearing military uniforms and holding officer ranks. There were incidents of violence. Black officers attacked for failing to show proper deference to white civilians. Della learned to stay on post when off-duty. It was safer. The other black nurses became her community. They understood what she was experiencing because they were experiencing it too. They supported each other, encouraged each other, reminded each other why they were there, to prove black nurses were just as capable as white nurses, to serve their country despite their country treating them as second-class citizens, to break barriers so future black nurses would face less discrimination. In 1943, the situation at Camp Livingston changed. The camp began receiving wounded soldiers evacuated from overseas. Men who had fought in North Africa, men who had been wounded in the Sicily invasion, men with combat injuries, gunshot wounds, shrapnel, infections from wounds that hadn't been properly treated in field hospitals. The station hospital became overwhelmed. Too many patients, not enough nurses. White nurses were working 18 20-hour shifts. They were exhausted. Patients weren't receiving adequate care because there simply weren't enough nurses to provide it. Men were dying from complications that proper nursing care could have prevented. Infections that weren't caught early enough. Surgical patients whose recovery wasn't properly monitored. Wounded men who needed constant attention to survive. Meanwhile, in the black section of the hospital, black nurses had capacity. They were treating black soldiers, but there weren't as many black patients. The black nurses could see what was happening in the white wards. They could hear the calls for nurses. They could see white nurses running themselves to exhaustion. They knew they could help, but regulations prohibited it. The hospital commander faced a choice: follow regulations and watch white soldiers die from lack of nursing care, or violate regulations, integrate the nursing staff temporarily, and save lives. He chose to save lives. Black nurses, including Lieutenant Della Raney Jackson, were ordered to begin treating white soldiers. This was extraordinary. It violated Army policy. It violated Louisiana state law regarding segregation. It violated every custom and practice of the segregated South. But men were dying, and nurses were available. Della and the other black nurses moved to the white wards. They began treating white soldiers, and they immediately encountered resistance. Some white soldiers refused treatment from black nurses. They saw a black woman in a nurse's uniform approaching their bed, and they reacted with anger, with insults, with outright refusal of care. "I want a white nurse," they would demand. "I'm not letting any black woman touch me." The head nurse, a white woman, would explain that all white nurses were assigned to other critically ill patients. Lieutenant Raney was a qualified nurse. She would provide excellent care. Some white soldiers accepted this grudgingly. Some refused. They literally preferred to suffer, to risk complications, to potentially die, rather than accept care from a black nurse. Della encountered this repeatedly. She would approach a white soldier to check vital signs, to change bandages, to administer medication. He would see her skin color and explode. Cursing, racial slurs, demands for a white nurse. She remained professional, calm. She explained she was his assigned nurse. She explained he needed treatment. She did not argue. She did not respond to insults. She did her job. Other white soldiers didn't care about the nurse's race. They were in pain. They were sick. They were scared. They needed help. If the nurse who could provide that help was black, that was fine. They accepted care gratefully. Some of these soldiers, raised in segregated communities who had never been treated by a black professional before, were surprised. They had been taught that black people were inferior, incapable of complex work. Then they received skilled nursing care from a black woman, and the cognitive dissonance was profound. One incident stood out in Della's memory. A white soldier from Mississippi had been wounded in Sicily. Shrapnel to the abdomen. He'd had surgery to remove the shrapnel and repair internal damage. The wound was infected. He needed constant monitoring, frequent dressing changes, intravenous antibiotics. Della was assigned to his care. When he realized his nurse was black, he was furious. He cursed her. He called her every racist slur he knew. He said he would rather die than have a black woman treat him. He demanded a white nurse. The head nurse explained that wasn't possible. All white nurses were assigned to critical patients. Lieutenant Raney was fully qualified. She would provide excellent care, or he could refuse treatment. His choice. He refused treatment for 24 hours, then 48 hours. His infection worsened. His fever spiked. He was becoming delirious. He was dying. Finally, too sick to resist, he allowed Della to treat him. She changed his dressings. She administered antibiotics. She monitored his vital signs every 2 hours. She stayed with him overnight when his fever peaked dangerously high, sponging him down to reduce the fever, keeping him hydrated, adjusting his medications. She saved his life. When he recovered enough to understand what had happened, he didn't thank her, but he stopped cursing at her. He tolerated her presence. He accepted her care without protest. When he was well enough to be discharged, he left without speaking to her. No thanks, no acknowledgement, just silence. Della told another black nurse about this. I saved his life, she said. He still won't look at me. Won't speak to me, but he's alive. That's what matters. That's what we're here to do. This became a pattern. Black nurses treating white soldiers who hated them, who insulted them, who refused to see them as equals, even while depending on them for survival. The black nurses remained professional. They provided the same quality care to everyone. They proved every day that race had nothing to do with nursing competence. They saved lives. The crisis at Camp Livingston lasted several months. As long as casualties kept arriving and white nurses remained overwhelmed, black nurses continued treating white soldiers. They proved themselves repeatedly. No mistakes, no failures, just competent professional nursing care. Then the crisis passed. Casualties decreased. More white nurses were assigned to Camp Livingston. The hospital had adequate staffing, and the black nurses were sent back to the black wards. No recognition for what they had done. No commendations. No acknowledgement that they had saved dozens, maybe hundreds of white soldiers' lives. No change in policy. Just back to segregated duties. Back to treating black patients only. Back to their place. The Army learned nothing from the experience. Or rather, they learned something and chose to ignore it. They learned that black nurses were just as skilled as white nurses. They learned that black nurses could handle the stress of caring for critically ill patients. They learned that integration didn't cause any problems except the problems created by white soldiers' racism. And they decided that maintaining segregation was more important than acknowledging these facts. So segregation continued. Black nurses remained restricted to treating black patients except during emergencies. Their skills were wasted. Their potential was limited. Their service was undervalued. All because of policies based on racism rather than any rational assessment of nursing competence. Della continued serving at Camp Livingston through 1944. She was promoted to first lieutenant. She gained more experience. She treated more patients. She saved more lives. And she continued facing discrimination every single day. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Della had served for 3 years. She had proven herself as a skilled professional nurse. She had broken barriers as one of the first black women commissioned as Army officers. She expected that the end of the war might mean the end of her military career. Many nurses were discharged when the military demobilized, but Della decided to stay. She made the Army her career. This was unusual. Most black nurses left after the war. They faced discrimination that made military service frustrating and difficult. They could earn better pay in civilian nursing without facing constant segregation. But Della stayed. Why? Because she believed she could make a difference. Because leaving would feel like admitting that the discrimination had won. Because she wanted to prove that black nurses belonged in the military. Because she was stubborn. The post-war years were difficult. The Army remained segregated until President Truman's executive order in 1948 began the slow process of integration. Even after formal segregation ended, informal discrimination persisted. Black officers faced barriers to promotion. They were passed over for choice assignments. They were judged more harshly than white officers. Della experienced all of this. She watched white nurses with less experience get promoted ahead of her. She was assigned to less desirable positions. She was subjected to evaluations that criticized her for things white nurses did without comment. But she persisted. She continued doing her job. She continued proving her competence. She was promoted to captain, then to major. Each promotion took longer than it should have. Each promotion required her to be better than the white officers competing for the same positions. She had to be twice as good to be considered half as equal. This is exhausting. Imagine working for decades, constantly proving yourself, constantly facing skepticism, constantly being held to higher standards than your white peers, never being able to relax, never being able to make a mistake, always representing your entire race. That was Della's career. 30 years of it. She served in multiple locations. Different army hospitals, different assignments. She gained expertise in various aspects of nursing care. She trained younger nurses. She supervised wards. She handled administrative responsibilities. She did everything an army nurse does, just while facing discrimination that her white colleagues never experienced. In the 1960s and 70s, as the civil rights movement forced America to confront its racism, the military slowly became more integrated. Black officers began receiving fairer treatment. Promotion opportunities improved. Discrimination didn't disappear, but it became less overt, less systematic. Della benefited from these changes. Her later promotions came more easily. She was recognized for her experience and expertise. But by then, she had already spent decades fighting for recognition that should have been automatic. Della retired from the Army in the 1970s as a major. She had served for over 30 years. She had earned numerous commendations and service ribbons. She had trained countless nurses. She had saved countless lives. She had broken barriers and proven that black nurses were equals. She settled in Detroit, Michigan. She became involved in veterans organizations. She spoke about her experiences to younger generations, encouraging black women to pursue military careers, telling them about the barriers she had faced and the changes she had seen. She lived to see the Army fully integrate. She lived to see black women become generals. She lived to see opportunities that had been denied to her become available to younger black women. This was gratifying but also bittersweet. She was glad that future generations wouldn't face what she faced. But she also knew that her own career had been limited by discrimination that should never have existed. On June 7, 1987, Della Raney Jackson died in Detroit, Michigan. She was 69 years old. She had lived a full life. She had served her country for over 3 decades. She had proven everything she set out to prove. She was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. This was fitting. Arlington is where America's honored military dead are laid to rest. Della had earned her place there through decades of service. Through her pioneering role as one of the first black women Army officers. Through her determination to prove that black nurses were equals, despite facing constant discrimination. The funeral included a military honor guard, a rifle salute, the folding and presentation of the American flag to her family. The ceremony acknowledged what Della had always insisted she was, a United States Army officer who had served with honor. For years after her death, Della's story remained largely unknown. She was one of hundreds of black nurses who had served in World War II and beyond. Their collective story was gradually rediscovered by historians researching black military service, but individual stories like Della's were often lost in the broader narrative. In 2011, the Army dedicated a monument to black nurses who served in World War II. The monument is located at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, home of the Army Medical Department. It honors approximately 500 black nurses who served during the war, women who faced discrimination but served anyway, who proved their competence despite being told they were inferior, who saved lives while being treated as second-class citizens. Della's name is on that monument. In recent years, there has been growing recognition of black nurses' contributions to military medicine. Their stories are being told in books, documentaries, academic research. The discrimination they faced is being acknowledged. Their achievements are being celebrated. But recognition decades after death doesn't change what these women experienced during their service. Doesn't undo the discrimination. Doesn't compensate for the opportunities denied. Doesn't give back the years spent proving what should have been obvious from the beginning. Della Raney Jackson's true story is not about dying on hospital steps. It's about living for 69 years. It's about serving for 30 years despite facing constant discrimination. It's about proving every single day that black nurses were just as skilled as white nurses. It's about saving white soldiers' lives even when those soldiers hated her. It's about remaining professional when patients insulted her. It's about continuing to serve when the Army refused to fully recognize her contributions. It's about making the military her career despite having every reason to quit. It's about opening doors for future generations of black women in the military. That's the real story. Not a dramatic death, but a determined life. Not a single tragic moment, but decades of quiet courage. Not dying as a victim, but living as a pioneer. The discrimination Della faced was real. Black nurses during World War II and beyond faced systematic barriers. Segregated facilities, restricted opportunities, hostile patients, skeptical supervisors, and a military establishment that valued maintaining racial hierarchy over utilizing all available talent. That discrimination cost lives. White soldiers died because black nurses weren't allowed to treat them. Black nurses watched men die, knowing they had the skills to save them, forbidden to act because of regulations based on racism rather than medical necessity. The temporary integration during emergencies like the one at Camp Livingston proved that black nurses were fully capable, but those lessons were deliberately ignored. The military chose to maintain segregation despite evidence that it was irrational and harmful. That choice reflected the broader American commitment to white supremacy. A commitment so strong that it persisted even when it meant worse medical care for white soldiers. Even when it meant wasting the skills of qualified black nurses. Even when it meant treating dedicated professionals as inferiors. Della's life exposed all of these contradictions. She proved black nurses were competent. The Army acknowledged this by using her to treat white soldiers during emergencies. But the Army refused to make permanent changes based on this evidence. She was good enough to save white soldiers' lives when no white nurse was available, but not good enough to treat white soldiers when white nurses were available. She was capable enough to be commissioned as an officer, but not respected enough to be promoted as quickly as white officers with equivalent qualifications. These contradictions defined her career, and her response to them defined her character. She could have quit. She could have left the Army and pursued civilian nursing, where the pay was better and the discrimination, while still present, was less systematic. She stayed. She could have become bitter. She could have let the discrimination poison her, make her angry, make her give up. She remained professional. She continued providing excellent care to all her patients, regardless of their race or how they treated her. She could have stayed quiet. She could have accepted the status quo, not challenged anything, just done her job and collected her pension. She spoke out. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, but persistently. She told her story. She encouraged other black women. She advocated for change. That combination of determination, professionalism, and advocacy is what made Della Raney Jackson a hero. Not dying tragically, but living courageously. Not being a victim, but being a pioneer. Not giving up, but persisting for 30 years until she proved what she knew from the beginning. Black nurses are equal. Today, the Army Nurse Corps is integrated. Black nurses serve in all specialties. They hold leadership positions. They deploy to combat zones. They train future nurses. They receive the same opportunities as white nurses. This didn't happen automatically. It happened because women like Della Raney Jackson refused to accept that their race made them inferior. It happened because they served despite discrimination. It happened because they proved their competence again and again until even the most resistant observers had to acknowledge the truth. Della didn't live to see all the changes she fought for. She died in 1987 when the military was more integrated than during her early career, but still far from perfect. But she lived long enough to see significant progress. She lived long enough to see black women become Army generals. She lived long enough to know that her 3 decades of service had made a difference. The lesson of Della Raney Jackson's life is not about tragedy. It's about perseverance. She faced systematic discrimination. She responded with systematic excellence. She was told she was inferior. She proved she was equal. She was denied recognition. She kept serving anyway. She was treated as second class. She never believed she was. That's the real story. That's the story worth telling. Not a false narrative about dying on hospital steps, but a true narrative about living with dignity despite facing indignity. About serving with honor despite being treated dishonorably. About persisting when quitting would be understandable. About proving yourself when you shouldn't have to. About opening doors for others when doors were slammed in your face. Della Raney Jackson served the United States Army for over 30 years. She rose to the rank of major. She trained countless nurses. She saved countless lives. She broke barriers as one of the first black women commissioned as Army officers. She proved that black nurses were just as capable as white nurses despite facing constant discrimination. She made the military better by her presence and her service. She died in 1987 and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Her legacy is not victimhood. Her legacy is achievement. Her legacy is the thousands of black women who have served in the Army Nurse Corps since she pioneered that path. Her legacy is the integrated military that she helped create through her persistent professional service. Her legacy is proof that courage isn't just about dramatic acts. Sometimes it's about showing up every day for 30 years and doing your job with excellence despite facing discrimination every step of the way. Remember Della Raney Jackson, not for a death that never happened, but for a life fully lived, for service honorably rendered, for barriers courageously broken, for a legacy rightfully earned. Major Della Raney Jackson, United States Army Nurse Corps, 1918 to 1987, pioneer, professional, proof that excellence transcends prejudice.